Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Okay, well, welcome back. Here we are in the merry month of May on Cinco de Mayo, and here for our fellowship. It's our custom to go around and say our names, so my name is Cass.
I'm Brad.
David.
My name is Christian.
I'm Sal.
Dennis.
Tim. Mike. Greg. My name is Jerry.
I'm Larry.
My name is Matthew.
I'm Tony. My name is Stephen.
Jack.
Ricardo.
Susan.
Phil.
I'm Hal.
Daniel.
Bob.
Don.
Jay.
Samuel.
I'm Kevin.
I'm Jason. So it's our great pleasure to have Kevin Griffin returning to speak with us today. He's an internationally respected Buddhist teacher known for his innovative work connecting Dharma and recovery, author of One Breath at a Time, Buddhism and the 12 Steps, and Living Kindness, Buddhist Teachings for a Troubled World. He's been a Buddhist practitioner for over 35 years and a teacher for 2 decades. With teachings firmly based in the Theravada Buddhist tradition, Kevin reaches a broad range of audiences in Dharma centers, wellness centers, and secular mindfulness settings. His website is kevingriffin.net. So welcome, Kevin.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for having me. I'm always happy to come over and visit this group. I live in Berkeley, and as I mentioned to a couple people, it's the ideal time to drive across the Bay Bridge Sunday morning. Very easy. Don't ask me to come on Friday night. I just finished teaching an 8-day retreat. Now, I don't teach a lot of retreats, and this was actually, I think, the longest retreat I've taught. And that finished yesterday, and so then I got home and I was like, oh, I have to give a talk tomorrow morning. What am I going to talk about? And thought, maybe I'll just use one of the things I used on the retreat. I try to save effort, at least I do. And then I thought, I realized that often when I give a talk to just a sitting group like this, that a lot of the references are kind of about practicing on retreat. And that's partly to inspire people to practice on retreat, and partly because a lot of the kind of deeper stuff and insights and experiences happen on retreats. But I also thought, well, maybe I should address things that are more relevant. So I thought today that I actually have a title for my talk, which I rarely have. And so my title is Finding Dharma in Daily Life. And so the most sort of obvious way that we get sort of approach this topic of daily life practice or finding Dharma in daily life is through practicing mindfulness in our daily lives. And that's becoming increasingly popular in a broad range of settings. And as my bio mentioned, secular settings for mindfulness. And that's really valuable and a foundation, I think, for any kind of serious practice is to start with that. But it's not what I was thinking of when I thought of this topic. It's all the things that potentially come out of being mindful that I wanted to look at. Maybe not all of them, but some of them. And what does being mindful reveal to us? Because there's a way in which I guess mindfulness has become sort of an end in itself in some way it's being presented. And it does have a value in and of itself to just be present. I'm just here, I feel my body, notice my thoughts, I feel my feelings, I'm aware of my sense experience. But I think for the Dharma to come alive, there needs to be more than just being present, sort of being here, but what do we do with that? And so that's where the kind of insight element of Dharma comes in. And to some extent, I see this as sort of divided between looking at the difficult stuff, but also looking at the pleasant or more uplifting stuff, and seeing both of those, I think, is finding Dharma in daily life. So to start with the kind of the difficult, because Buddhism and the Buddhist foundational teaching is the Four Noble Truths that start with the truth of suffering, and this in itself is an important thing to see. In the First Noble Truth, when the Buddha talks about suffering, about the difficulties of being a human being or just being alive, he says we need to understand that. And to understand dukkha, the word that we translate as suffering, to understand that means we have to look at it. And that in and of itself there's a challenge. Because we don't want to see suffering in ourselves or in others. We don't want to see the suffering in the world. There's a feeling that maybe we'll be overwhelmed, or that it'll be too painful to see that, and I suppose various things, various reasons we don't want to see it. But I think that's mostly what it is, our aversion to being exposed to it. We'd rather not look. So this is the kind of the first challenge of the practice of Dharma, practice of Buddhism, is to be willing to look at the suffering. And mindfulness is a foundational tool for doing that, because it not only helps us to see clearly, but it also helps us to receive what we see, in a balanced way. Because if we just are looking at suffering without some internal balance, some internal kind of quality of groundedness and perspective, then we can get swept away by it. So mindfulness is sort of the foundation for doing all of this work. And so when we look at dukkha, when we look at suffering, we look at it within ourselves. And this is a critical thing to do, because as a recovering addict, I know that I wasn't willing to look at my own suffering. I just wanted to cover it over. I wanted to submerge it with alcohol. So that's actually not a bad metaphor, submerging. Just put it in the bottle and shake it up. And so in coming into recovery, which is almost 34 years now, that I had to be willing to let the feelings be there. And again, I was already a mindfulness practitioner, so I had that foundation for holding those feelings. And of course, you don't have to be an addict to have feelings that you don't want to feel. That's a common human condition. But we know that if we keep pushing aside our feelings, if we keep suppressing our feelings, that ultimately it just undermines our happiness and in fact can undermine our physical health as well. So this is part of seeing Dharma in daily life, as being willing to look at my own pain, And then, of course, seeing the pain of others around us. Starting with the dukkha, I'll get to the good stuff. I hope. I can get really into dukkha, but to see, even to see the suffering of our family or our friends, that's difficult too. When I was working on my first book, One Breath at a Time, I was doing a section on compassion, and I was trying to sort of create a meditation for it. And I realized that it was easy for me to sort of do these loving kindness and compassion practices for all beings and for people out there. But that meanwhile my wife was upstairs, and I wasn't really thinking about her, that I didn't really want to look at her suffering. But that was, it was kind of too close in a way. It's like, we just kind of and so I built that practice to include her and to allow myself to feel her suffering or to be aware of her suffering. And then further, of course, if we look out into the world, we've got all the suffering we could ever, handle looking at. And here becomes another challenge. And, I grew up, really came of age in the 60s, and was really opposed to the Vietnam War and became really cynical about politics, so that by the time I was of age to vote, I didn't vote for a long time. It wasn't until I was in my 30s that I voted. And it was related to this. It was that I didn't want to be involved. I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to read the news or know anything that was going on in the world. Just wanted to stay out of it. So I was a musician, a stoner. It was like, I've got my own world. But that's not exactly being a participant in your community. So in my newest book, Living Kindness, I have a chapter that's called The Greed, Hatred, and Delusion Report. And it's about reading the news. But it's like reading the news through the lens of Dharma, rather than sort of looking at things as particular and unique, but seeing them as just, there's an example of hatred, there's an example of greed, there's an example of delusion. And in seeing that, and there's plenty of that, but in seeing that, we also realize that that's not new news, right? That's old news. That's the news that's been around forever. That's why the Buddha talked about it 2,500 years ago. He was, was born in a royal family and had relationships with many of the leaders of the different sort of principalities in North India at that time. So even after his awakening, he would go and meet with kings and princes and answer their questions, sometimes about should they attack their neighbor. So he was very aware of the realities of the world, and he wasn't a recluse he wasn't a hermit. He was engaged and cared about that, but he was also just very aware that the roots of human conflict are in each of us. So even when we read the Greed, Hatred, and Delusion Report, we don't sort of point fingers. We kind of go, oh yeah, I recognize that. I recognize that anger in me is the same thing that ultimately leads to nations fighting with each other. So the point of all this is not to submerge, I guess maybe that's my word for the morning, yourself in the misery of all this, but rather to be able to hold it differently. To be able to see that this is the way things are, and see that accepting things as they are actually allows a kind of serenity, and this is kind of echoing the serenity prayer. May I accept the things I cannot change. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. So that there's this implication in that prayer that when we accept things, there is some serenity. And that's the message that I get from a lot of Buddhist teachings. Because sometimes, some of the teachings seem demanding to a point that's unrealistic. Like there's a story that I tell in Living Kindness about a man whose son has died, and he's out of his mind with grief. And he comes to the Buddha, and the Buddha says, "Come to your senses. You have to come to your senses." He says, "Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are born from those who are dear." It's this shocking statement. It's not a crazy statement, but it shocks the man, and he can't accept it. And he goes off and he argues with the Buddha, and then he goes off and sees some gamblers. And he says, "This is what the Buddha said," but that's wrong, right? Because happiness comes from those who are dear, right? And the gamblers all say, "Yes, you're right. The happiness comes from those who are dear." Now, in a Buddhist teaching, if you agree with the gamblers and not with the Buddha, that's an indication that you're going down the wrong track. But I've had to reflect on this question. I'm a husband and a father. I have a daughter, and if she were to die, I would suffer deeply. And so, if you just took this teaching to maybe your next conclusion might be, okay, I guess the Buddha thinks we shouldn't hold anyone dear, or that we shouldn't have intimate relationships, or we shouldn't have a family. And I think, well, that doesn't sound right. He had many lay followers. He didn't tell people, don't have children. Yeah, in fact, he had instructions about how to be a good parent and how to be a good child. So, thinking further about why the Buddha is saying that, I think what he's saying is, this is the way it is. If your child dies, it's going to hurt. But if you know that, if you understand that, then you don't sort of take that. There's sorrow there, but it doesn't mean you have to go crazy, because it's life. It's loss and it's life, and life is filled with loss. And we need to be able to hold these things, right? We need to be able to hold suffering. And it's a great challenge in Buddhism. The Buddha doesn't sort of come out and say, here, just do this and everything's going to be okay. You're going to be, I'm going to just pray or believe in this, and then, you'll transcend all suffering. There is a way in which the freedom that comes seems to be much more, as we know, about letting go. But the letting go, in this case, is the letting go of the fight with the truth. When we fight with truth is when we really suffer. I won't belabor the point. So, going back to sort of some of the things that we can kind of see and integrate into our lives, integrate Dharma into our lives, so it's not just something we do on a cushion or read in a book. We see suffering. We also see everything is changing. We see impermanence. And this is another teaching. Well, that's, of course, the fundamental teaching about loss and grief. But that when we can accept that, when we get a flat tire, we don't go, what is wrong with the world? It's falling apart. Tires should never go flat. Why should a tire go flat? That's insane. I can't stand this. I'm suing the tire company. And we turn it into a conflict with reality, whereas if you see things through the lens of Dharma, you say, oh, tires are impermanent. Okay, next tire. And this tire that I get that they guarantee I'll have for 10,000 miles. Well, 10,000 miles is impermanence too. That'll just, I'll do that in a couple of years, it'll be gone, And the difference between those attitudes, right, is profound. It's just how we are viewing and responding to the world. Are we expecting the world to be a certain way that we want it to be, or are we looking at the way it really is and accepting that? Learning to appreciate that. I remember James Barrows, one of my teachers, talking about, if things were permanent, then you'd still just have your first best friend. You would never would have met anybody else in your life. Or, and you think, that would really be a problem if things never changed. I don't know when they would freeze, but whenever they froze, you'd be like, yeah, but I'd like to have something different for dinner. Impermanence is what actually makes life interesting. It's what makes life exciting. So maybe now to talk about some of the sort of positive things that we can find, where we can find the Dharma in daily life. And the first, most obvious place is the amount of love there is in the world. And this is not usually covered on the front page of the Greed, Hatred, and Delusion report. But sometimes I just reflect, especially like when I'm doing a lot of loving kindness meditation, and I'm trying to come up with more people to send love to, just because I want to stretch it out, I'll start to go down my block in Berkeley. And I know most of my neighbors. We have a block party once a year. It's a very nice, quiet block. It doesn't. The street's kind of ends at a T about a block away, so not a lot of people are cutting through the neighborhood. So it's a nice, quiet street. And when I go down that street, one of the it's very nice to kind of see everybody and their kids and just kind of send loving kindness to each one. But I also kind of realize just how much love there is on that block, and that it's just an ordinary block of houses in an ordinary, semi-ordinary town. But essentially just like any other place in the world. And people aren't running up and down the street screaming at each other or shooting each other or bombing each other. There's not a lot of, or stealing from each other. There isn't a lot of greed, hatred, and delusion going on Vincenti Avenue in Berkeley. And I think that's true of most places in the world. Of course there's conflict. There's one neighbor, there was a thing about the scratch on their car, and they never let it go, That's one person out of 30 houses on this block. And I think that sometimes we forget that most of the people in the world are living lives where they care for people, that they love people, that they're kind to people, that they're generous to people. The conflict, the reason it's the news is because it's unusual, right? It's the old, man bites dog. That's what makes the news. When a dog bites a man, that's normal, so it doesn't get in the news. So the normal course of events in the world doesn't get covered. So I think it's really helpful for us to remind ourselves when you can walk down the street anywhere, walk down Mission and see people pushing their strollers or lovers arm in arm, and there's so much love in the world that's just there that we just sort of assume and sort of forget how precious it is. Another piece that I really like, and this is very similar to that, but it's just appreciation. And there's a practice in the Brahma Viharas usually called sympathetic joy, but I like the translation appreciative joy, where I just appreciate things. different ways of appreciating the world. One thing I like to do, like when you go to a new town, it doesn't have to be a new place, but when you're traveling and you're just walking through like some European city and you're just looking at the buildings, and you're like, wow, there's just this appreciation that you have, right? The appreciation of beauty. And of course, in nature, that's there all the time. And so this is, of course, about being awake. Just to reiterate, mindfulness is required for all these things. If you're not paying attention, you can walk right through the most beautiful place in the world and not see a thing. We know that. Right? But when you're awake, there's so much to see. I really like this room, by the way. This is one of my favorite meditation halls in the Bay Area. I love the brick walls, the skylight, and the floors. It's just like a really lovely room. And do you get, do you remember that sometimes when you come in here? Like, oh, it's nice to be here. Right? This is a good space. It's good energy. And this is what, so I guess part of what I'm talking about too is what we call right effort. A right effort is I'm awake and I'm mindful. Now what am I going to do with that attention? And it's making an effort to, I'm not just going to be passively walking through the world. I'm going to actually walk through the world awake, seeing love, appreciating things. Another way we find Dharma in the world is through generosity. Through our own generosity, through the generosity of others. When people help you, when you have when you help someone, the joy that you find in that. Of course, the Dharma is founded in generosity. As I said, I just finished teaching a retreat, and it's totally Dharma based in terms of the teachers. There were 4 of us. And talk about a joyful thing, to be able to just teach and say, I'm not charging a fee. We had to charge for the housing at Vajrapani, but I don't know what I'm going to get. It always feels, I have to say, a little bit like Christmas morning when we open the envelope. I wonder what we got. Because it's all sort of extra in a way, but almost every time I teach a retreat, I get more than I expect. And I try not to expect. But of course the mind sort of does little things like, well, maybe I'll well. And, and I then texted the other teachers to let them know. They were like, wow, that's great. The people were so generous. And just to see that, it's so, so sweet. It's just amazing to say, you don't have to give me anything. And people give you a lot. And you're like, wow, shit, okay. So I'm always like, somebody might be there like, suckers, they're not charging. I'm getting off easy here. People can easily do that, right? But they don't. So I've got a book I picked up at Spirit Rock. It's a big, sort of like, what do they call it? Is it like a table top book? Coffee table book. Right? I don't drink coffee. That must be my spot there. I was going to say a cocktail table. I don't drink cocktails either, but they're more embedded in my brain, I guess. It's called Drawdown, and it's about the environment, and it's a roadmap, basically, for the Green New Deal. It's a roadmap for how to change our relationship to energy in the world and the environment, how to heal the environment. And it's just huge, and it's got all these different essays. It's edited by, is it Paul Hawken, the guy from Smith and Hawken? Yeah, so he edited it. And it's one of those books I just kind of pick up, and I'll just read one passage, and it's beautiful pictures. And so I read this passage last week, and I read it again last night because I wanted to talk about it. It's from a book called The Hidden Life of Trees. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how you feel about trees, but I love trees, and sometime in the last couple of years, I started to really get into the trees. And not in any kind of studying them or anything, but just looking at them. I guess I was on a self-retreat. I started just, I don't know how many of you have been on retreats. You know how you can kind of get into a space where you just stop and you just look at something. I was just looking at some trees, and the way they were moving with the wind, I started to feel like their life, but I also kind of felt like like there was a consciousness in how they were moving, and that's probably projection, but I also started noticing how groups of trees were obviously related, and started thinking about them as families. And it's just like a really warm, sweet feeling, and just feeling really connected. And so in this piece about the hidden life of trees, the author, and I don't remember his name, but he describes walking through a forest and seeing something that he thought was a rock, and sort of knocking under, scratching at it, and realizing it was an old tree trunk. And but then he saw a little bit of green, and he scratched away and saw that there was green on the tree trunk, that it was actually alive. And he knows enough about trees that he could tell that the tree was had been chopped down like a couple hundred years ago. And he was trying to think through like how that could be, because he says this, the little bit I know, wouldn't have really thought of this, but he says, without photosynthesis, trees can't survive, and so a tree trunk that doesn't have any leaves on it can't get any nutrient from the sun. He said what they've found is that underground, the roots of trees actually take care of each other, and that they'll actually give food from their roots to a tree that's been chopped down. And that the systems underground, his conclusion was, we really don't even know how much is going on among these trees, but that it's a lot more complicated, and there's a lot more interconnection than we could imagine. That they're living together, that they're almost more like one organism rather than one family. And that just struck me as like such a beautiful example of interconnection, one of the Dharmic principles that is very revealing when we look at the world, because, maybe this seems like a jump, but when I look at a community, like human beings have decided that we're going to all live together and cooperate. And again, even though we sort of have this sense of all this conflict in the world, there's this city here, that depends on everybody in this city. And that depends on generations of people far in the past who built stuff and, who decided, well, we need to have water, so we got, these amazing systems. And then somebody shows up to make your coffee for you. And, they're serving you. They're part of, we're all, that somebody comes down our street every week and picks up our garbage. I didn't ask him to do that. That's just like what humans do. We've agreed to all work together. We could have agreed that we're not going to work together. It could be just a world where everybody's fighting and trying to get something for themselves. And yes, of course, there's an argument that there's something of that goes on as well. But essentially, civilization is built on the idea that we're all going to help each other. And we're all going to do our part. And some people abuse it, but most people don't. Most people obey the law and can cooperate and do little things that help each other. Every job. We think of our jobs as being, well, that's the way I support myself. But it's equally true that that's the way I support the world. In any, there are very few jobs except, people who, professional criminals that are actually, not about supporting the world. And I just find that reflection to be something that's very comforting for me. You know, it makes me feel just the love of the world, the love of human beings, that we've chosen to be this way. So I think that's a good place to stop. It's just the main idea that I'm really trying to put across is that if we make a little bit of effort with our mindfulness to shift our perspective on the world, we can see the Dharma all around us, in everything that we do, in everything that we see, in everything that we feel, everything we experience. And that is how we really bring this practice alive, how we make it meaningful beyond just the experiences of peace or mental experiences that we have through meditation. So I'd love to hear any thoughts or reflections from anyone. Yeah, Jeff.
Thank you for coming, Kevin. I really appreciate it. It strikes me how powerful what you're saying about the Three Natures and Delusion report. I mean, that's like on every channel.
Yeah.
And, newspapers, and it's just bombarding us all the time. And it's easy to make it part of our confirmation bias,
Yeah, exactly.
It's just, that's how it is. And it's all falling apart.
Yeah, yeah,
Corruption.
yeah.
It's a good case for not watching so much news. And I appreciate long traveling trips sometimes because I get a detox from news.
Yeah. Yeah, and I remind myself, and I mentioned this in the book, that the reason that's what's reported is because that's what sells. It's purely an economic model. It's not, it's not purely. There's an element of it, of course, that's meant to be information, and so that people know what's going on in the world. But the way it's developed over time now has just become this economic model. And of course, when, just to, get very specific, when the current president leaves the scene, it's going to be a real disaster for the news industry. They're going to, it's really going to hurt them. And
they'll find other negative stuff.
They'll find something else. Yeah, but I don't know. He's just so entertaining. And so, and I think, that could, actually influence the way things play out. Because, we'll see. When we get to,
Thank you very much. It was a lot to think about. You talked about when loved ones are suffering, and so from what you said, I guess the first thing would be some acceptance. This is the way things are, even with someone you love, and maybe trying to pay more attention, to be more mindful about what they say and what they're going through. But beyond that, I'm moved to try to help alleviate that suffering.
Of course.
And so, do you have any clues?
Well, I certainly didn't mean to imply that you should just accept the suffering and sorry, I really feel bad for you. But of course, we want to respond, and responding is the key word rather than reacting, right? And responding takes care and mindfulness and intuition, reflection, so that our efforts to be of help are actually helpful and aren't efforts to relieve our own discomfort. I'm not sure exactly what you're hoping I'll say. I would love to say what you're hoping I'll say. If I knew what it was. But you know what? The thing is that in this situation, we have to take care of ourselves and hold our own sorrow or suffering around our loved one's suffering, and then to see what, see if there is something. I mean, of course, it all depends on whether it's emotional suffering or physical suffering, mental suffering. All have to be addressed differently. I'm thinking about something. I actually don't want to record it, so but that I'm trying to solve around a loved one's suffering, and so how to be of service is like, it's tricky, right? It's a lot easier to either ignore or just jump in and try to fix things than it is to go, well, what would really be helpful? How are they going to respond? It just takes care, and that mindfulness, clear comprehension is an element of mindfulness that helps us to, or that I don't know if it's the element of mindfulness that kind of does sort of solve things and kind of find that appropriate action going forward. Yeah.
I really appreciated the piece there that you were talking about the trees, the roots of trees, and supporting each other. And what it brings up for me is this greater intelligence that's functioning everywhere, that's hardly dissolved. And when I can get my own activity out of the way to receive it, to be open to my own Buddha nature, own true nature, I think is a huge part of the work. And part of that, I think, for me, it does involve suffering. It's actually the suffering that, if I finally surrender to it, brings me to my heart, a more open place.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. That's well put. When we can just turn towards it, then something opens us in us, and we have to kind of trust that, because that's what we're kind of. We're afraid it's going to lead us somewhere else, but something more beautiful happens when we open to that.
Yeah, it's so paradoxical.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Something came up as you were saying that. I mean, one thing is that the further, like the bigger picture of interconnection that Thich Nhat Hanh, he talks about when you're eating something, reflecting on the fact that all that was involved in it coming to you, that the sun and the rain and the earth, made something grow, and then of course people came and cultivated and then picked it or harvested it and then carried it and processed it and then you're in the checkout line. And it's all like this a complex interaction that we sort of take for granted and forget that we are the recipients of this system that supports us.
Yeah. I also really enjoyed your imagery of the roots sustaining other roots. And I remember recently about mushrooms. I don't know if it's true for all mushrooms, but it is? Okay. Thank you. But when you see a mushroom, it's kind of like having an apple tree that's horizontal and buried under the ground. Whenever you see an apple, that's part of the tree. So when you see a mushroom in various places, that's just the fruit of this giant organism that's living underneath the soil. And I read somewhere there's some, I guess it's a mushroom, fungus of some sort, that like one of the biggest living things on the planet. You think of sequoia trees. This thing is extended for miles and miles underneath them, just pop up every now and then with a mushroom. And I thought that was a very gripping image of life going on that we don't see, all this activity, and we only see little expressions of it periodically from place to place.
Yeah, and interestingly, in this piece from The Hidden Life of Trees, he says that where the roots don't reach, there are fungi in the ground that then actually sometimes will take nutrients to other trees and to other nutrients. So that's apparently, I mean, these science, as we know, like, can really open up these spiritual images for us in terms of it.
So these mushrooms are the Mother Teresa of plant life.
Yeah. Well, and I know that what I was thinking about about intelligence, that how the intelligence of nature and how humans think that they're the most intelligent beings on earth, and of course we are potentially going to kill ourselves with our intelligence, and that the earth would be very happy if we were gone. The earth would be fine. It's like we're not. Through its natural intelligence, of course, it would, come back and everything would be fine, and as long as no more humans came back, it would survive. The so-called natural world would thrive without us. So, little irony there.
There's a Buddhist monk called Ed Brown who wrote a poem about, I think it was like eating an apple, and he was contemplating about the migrant workers that grew the apple, and the truckers that drove the apple there, and the waitresses in 3 o'clock in the morning poured coffee for those truckers.
Yeah.
And all this going on, so you just have this one apple in front of you.
Yeah. Well, right, and it's both. There's both the natural system and the human system that makes that all work. That cooperation. Yeah. So I guess trees and humans.
I was thinking about the whatever you were not going to share because it's being recorded and how to respond to suffering. And about the system of the natural intelligence of the trees. And what it strikes me as is that intelligence is a useful way of thinking about it. And at the same time, it's not necessarily intelligence in the sense of rationality and thinking it through. And I was reflecting upon times when there have been people who were suffering. My brother was an IV drug user since he was 13 till he died when he was 49. And there'd be times that I would sort of think through what is the right thing to do and how can I fix this and what can I do. And then there were other times where it wasn't like I thought it through, but like some idea just came to me that seemed like it was appropriate. And I had this experience, and I don't know if this is your experience writing or not, but I was writing, I do a lot of writing, it's basically what I do, and I was writing something that I've written about for a long time, and then these 2 ideas came to me. I don't know if at the same time or different times, and they were like 2 of the best ideas I'd ever had. It's like kind of astonishing, and I can't recreate where they came from. It wasn't like I sat down and brainstormed a problem or something. It just came. Oh, I actually will say that one of them did come immediately after I had meditated. So I got up and then it popped into my head, but hadn't been thinking about it. So like the trees, in a sense, like they're not necessarily intelligent in the sense that they're plotting what
Right.
they do,
Not at all.
but they're somehow responding, and there might be like a part of our own, whether it's minds or maybe it doesn't operate through the mind, part of our own responsiveness that might be, like if we see someone in pain, like if I see an animal in pain or something, I'll just step down to help. I saw a dog walking on the street and I realized it was limping. And then I got up and said, excuse me, I think your dog has something in its foot. And sure enough, it had one of those little like grass-like things.
Yeah, fox.
Yeah, fox trail. What is it?
Foxtail. Yeah.
Yeah, and it came out, but it wasn't like I really thought it through.
Right.
It was just like, oh, there it is.
Yeah. Well, that might be love, or it might just be, some kind of evolutionary something, it just, but yeah, I mean, how we, interesting, just the question of how we define intelligence. And we live in a culture that defines intelligence by you're really good at taking standardized tests, or something like that. And that's not how I define intelligence. And as you say, that in the arts, and any artist knows that you don't create art. It's much more just something that comes through when you're, and that's why meditating, quieting the surface noise of the mind allows the innate intelligence that you don't really have control over, that you didn't even make, just like it's in us, that potential. I mean, when people like Einstein talk about like their revelations, it's not like, oh yeah, I sat down and I was taking a shower and then I was like, whatever, it just came. It's one of the wonders. Again, I guess what strikes me is we try to control the world and we try to control things, and we want them to be a certain way or something. And when if there's a trust, if there's an engagement and an intention for something good, and then we kind of open ourselves to that, then that's where the best, I think, ideas and responses come from. So it looks like we're getting
Yeah, I think
out of time.
I think we're at the time.
Can I do one more response real quick?
Sure.
Great. I've just been sitting here, my name's Jason, and I've been struggling with your reflection on your neighborhood in Berkeley, and about your need to hold on to that as an idea that a lot of other neighborhoods will experience what you experience.
Fair enough.
And that's not my experience as an urbanite in San Francisco, in the Lower Knob Hill, and divide between Upper Rich and the Tenderloin. And I just sit with that and the social strife and the challenge, even in my building, to actually acknowledge each other. Is not a neighborhood experience as what I had experienced 2 weeks ago staying in Berkeley for a weekend. And you live in there's a lot of nature around Berkeley, like craftsmen's houses. And so I just sit with kind of the challenge with this need to hold that as a reflection upon all around us. But I want to say that I do appreciate the ability for myself to walk around my neighborhood and to see trees, and to see, even in the most urban environment, a tree that is pretty with a homeless person lying somewhere close to it, and just acknowledge that there still is beauty around my neighborhood, but it has to be really sought after.
You're right. Thank you, Jason. That's just really a reminder for me of, my limited perspective of the privilege that I live in, So I need to be reminded. Thank you. And I still hope that everybody wants love in their lives. It doesn't manifest maybe as much as I like to think it does.
I guess it's the systems that, even though you acknowledge the systems, there are other systems that dismantle the ability.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad we got that final question, because I wouldn't have wanted you to walk away feeling that. I mean, without being able to say that.
Thank you. Please stay and enjoy the privilege of our fellowship. There are vegan treats, and there's hot water for tea. If you have tea, please put your cup in the sink, and we'll take care of heating it. Dana is the Pali word for generosity, and so your generosity will help us support the activities of the Sangha, including the Larkin Street dinners, the newsletter that goes mainly to those who are incarcerated, but spreads the word from our Sangha out into the world, pays for the rent of this beautiful space, and allows us to offer donations to our speakers. At 12:30, some people gather at the front door and go out to lunch, and everybody's welcome to join them. Just in terms of the generosity, I'll be going around with the Dharma bowl, and $10 is a suggestion, but please, whatever you are moved to contribute. So, are there any other announcements?
Our speaker next week will be Pam Weiss.
Okay. Then can we gather for the dedication?
Exactly.
By the power and truth of this practice, may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all be free from sorrow and the causes of sorrow. May all never be separated from the sacred happiness which is without sorrow. And may all live in equanimity without too much attachment or too much aversion, believing in the equality of all that lives.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.